Welcome to the Archaeology Studio. Today's episode considers ways of thinking about the past in archaeology. At least in my perspective, archaeology involves the search for facts about the past. Those facts could be obtained directly from the past in the forms of material objects in ancient sites, artifacts, middens, sedimentary layers, and landscapes. Those objective findings, of course, could be interpreted toward developing or testing larger ideas or subjective notions about the past. Anyone could think about the past in terms of the reality of objective facts or the possibilities of subjective interpretations. Both of those approaches are useful, and ideally, they can strengthen each other. For people who stress the objective data from the past, they tend to look at the information content from each time period, one by one, in chronological order. In this approach, the past time periods, in a sense, speak for themselves. Their metaphorical voices are incomplete and spoken in a language that we might not understand clearly today, but we can identify the pieces of raw data that have survived. For people who stress the possibilities of subjective interpretations of the past, they necessarily impose their own present-day notions into the past. This imposition of present-day bias into the past could be controlled through self-awareness and critical reflexive thought. More problematic, though, are the tendencies to think about archaeology as reaching from the present into the past, rather than working with the actual strengths of archaeology to reveal the facts of the past in their own terms. In a technical sense, every time when I excavate into an ancient sedimentary layer, then my physical hands and my tools are reaching into past contexts, but my modern-day notions and biases are rendered inactive. The technical procedures of an excavation can be performed with the simple goal of obtaining as much descriptive factual data as possible. In this way, I can expose the objective facts in their original contexts, and I can describe those objects in their natural chronological order. Later, I can apply any intellectual interpretation, and I can test the accuracy of this interpretation against the real data. In my approach, I present the plain descriptive data from past time periods, and then I can attempt to apply different subjective interpretations. As long as the objective facts support the interpretive conclusions, then logically this approach can be productive. I should clarify that most of my colleagues in academic archaeology would disagree with my approach. They are not shy about criticizing others, including me, for not using enough intellectual theory in a way that they could understand. In my view, these criticisms expose themselves as laughable. My personal bias always is in favor of the objective point of view, and I make an effort to demonstrate how my subjective interpretations are based as strongly as possible on the objective factual datasets in archaeology. If my colleagues want to criticize me as being too plainly descriptive in my work, then they have proven my point. As an archaeologist, my work mostly has involved basic chronological narratives about how landscapes have changed through time and how people have lived through those changing conditions over the course of several centuries or millennia. When I look at any place on the surface today, then I know that the surface shows me only the last time when people inhabited this place. If I want to learn about ancient time periods, then I need to investigate below the surface and situate those subsurface findings in terms of the ancient landscape of the associated time period, Moreover, maybe I will find evidence from multiple time periods, and then I would need to clarify the chronological order of how this landscape had changed through those multiple time periods. In my approach as an archaeologist, I begin with a factual descriptive chronology of the place where I am researching. The results reveal a chronological narrative of multiple time periods in their own natural order. With this indisputable objective baseline of my work, I know that I can build confident and logical interpretations of the data. In my view, a chronological narrative is a natural way of presenting the past in its own terms, revealing plainly how the world has changed through time. In this way, the past is exposed as more than a singular or monothetic entity of the past. Rather, each past time period can be appreciated in its own context, and those multiple contexts can be presented in a correct chronological order. Awkwardly, most of my colleagues in academic archaeology look at the ground surface today, and they find places with exposed old ruins or eroded pieces of artifacts and food middens. They may never learn about older archaeological layers beneath the surface unless they just happen to encounter an older subsurface layer beneath their target of their own surface visible interest. In my view, this approach epitomizes the imposition of modern-day bias into the past. This procedure of looking only for surface visible sites necessarily creates a bias from a modern-day perspective. This approach is extremely effective if you want to be ignorant of older time periods. Moreover, the bias in favor of later aged surface visible or near surface sites creates genuinely interesting opportunities to link those findings with historical and traditional knowledge of later time periods. Yet, of course, this approach introduces even more bias from the present imposed into the past. When my colleagues view the archaeological record from the present, then their limited access to the chronological data can bring them to propose incomplete or faulty interpretations. Their bias has by default made them blind to the facts of long-term chronological change, and they are incapable of addressing chronological research questions unless they can accept the findings from archaeologists like myself, who illogically are criticized for producing the primary data sets of descriptive chronological sequences. Unfortunately for my academic colleagues, the people who they criticize, like me, actually perform the basic archaeological work, publish the primary datasets, and provide logical interpretations based on the real data of archaeology. Many of my colleagues have published repeatedly about the impracticality of finding deeply buried subsurface archaeological layers. They note correctly that ancient archaeological layers could be undetectable on the present-day ground surface, and therefore a major effort would be needed just in order to test whether or not any older layers even existed. My colleagues make this point as if it proves their bias in favor of surface visible sites. All I can say in response is that I consistently have been satisfied with all of my work to find deeply buried archaeological layers, and my findings always have been useful, either as positive or negative findings. Without these kinds of efforts, the basic objective facts of archaeology never would be known, and then any intellectual exercises in subjective interpretation would become meaningless or, at best, misdirected. Overall, I see two fundamental ways of thinking about the past. One perspective looks at all of the objective material evidence in chronological order. Another perspective prefers to offer subjective interpretations imposed from the present into the past, often without actually knowing about the basic facts in their correct chronological order. If you have seen some of the older videos in this YouTube channel, then you know that I often refer to the relationship between objective data and subjective interpretation in archaeology. If you want for me to update or expand on these issues, then please share your suggestions in the comment section here. In concluding this episode, now you should be prepared to discuss different ways of thinking about the past in archaeology. What are your opinions about how to conceptualize the past and how to learn from archaeology? Please remember to subscribe to this channel, share with your friends, and see new videos every month with the Archaeology Studio.